old were you?
She took all her clothes off and stood there in front of me completely naked. I was so excited and nearly dropped my skateboard.
Skateboard? How old were you?
12.
12? 12 years old? You lost your virginity when you were 12? 12?
There's a saying in the north of England, where there's muck, there's brass, which basically means that you can make money out of shit, that there is something to be valued in just about anything. So let's try and extract some brass from the recent muck, shall we? I don't think it's a controversial statement to say that the age of consent is a hard and fast rule about something that can be and is actually fairly fuzzy. Rates of maturation vary from person to person. They vary on average between men and women. Different nations have different ages of consent, most of which at least start in your teenage years. Let's not excuse Islam's genuine paedophilia and child marriage in some cultures while we're exploring this. And let's try and get through this without accusing anybody of being a paedophile, because it's just not accurate. Let's actually have a discussion. Please feel free to make response videos or to comment on this topic. But anyway, I don't think it's controversial to say that maturation rates vary, that different nations have different standards, but that the overall standard appears to be that of puberty and emotional maturation. So given that, that has implications on the law. The law is both an ass and a blunt instrument in regards to everything, not just the age of consent. In the US, the age of consent varies from state to state. In Europe, the age of consent varies from country to country. In the UK, it's 16. In Holland, it can go as low as 12. In some countries, it's 18. It used to be differentiated between heterosexual and homosexual sex in the UK. I think to an extent it still is in some ways. Ask Pete Tatchell, I'm not an expert on that. And that probably still varies in other countries as well. All of this spread of discussion about it shows that this is not a hard and fast binary topic. It's not like you tick over from 17 and then the next day it's your birthday and you're 18 and suddenly some switch goes off in your brain and suddenly you're a fully mature sexual adult. It's a graduated process. Some people mature younger, some people mature older, and yet we're trying to apply this legal binary to an incredibly messy, incredibly subjective, differentiated biological, emotional and psychological stage of development. So, there is room for discussion here. We have to draw a line somewhere, but where should we draw the line and how fuzzy should that line be? I went digging for some stats on this, and the average age at which people lose their virginity in the UK used to be 17. It's dropped more recently to 16, and about a third of men and about a quarter of women lose their virginity prior to 16. Now this probably horrifies, from experiences I've had, a good number of Americans who seem to, even though it varies from state to state, seem to regard 18 as being the cut-off point, and anything prior to that being terrible and disgusting. Here it's 16 and nobody particularly bats an eyelid if it's 15. People start to get twitchy if it gets as low as 14, and it could get lower than that. 12 seems to be where some people, a reasonable percentage of people, lose their virginity. Of course, they're losing their virginity to other kids of the same age, which puts a bit of a different cast on things. Here you're talking about teens experimenting and messing around with each other. I remember more mature kids than I was started necking and you know, that sort of thing when they were 11, when I was still in primary school, and then you hit secondary school and everything kind of takes off from there. You know, pretty much everyone hits puberty pretty hard. So while we may disapprove of that and think it's wrong and we don't want kids having full sex, you know, that's when this stuff starts to kick in. And I think most of us would extend a reasonable amount of leeway to teenagers mucking about with each other. I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth watching this video, but I dare say that most of us would not regard it as paedophilia if the age of consent was 18 and you had one partner who was one day over 18 having sex with another partner who was one day under 18. So I think pretty much everyone would accept that that's an okay amount of leeway to have, that that's not a case of anyone being abused. Okay, well, let's think about that. What if it was 2 days each way? A week? A month? A year? What if it's a 19-year-old and a 17-year-old? What if it's a 20-year-old and a 16-year-old? What if it's a 21-year-old and a 15-year-old? Is that where the squick really starts to kick in? At what point does this actually become unacceptable to you? Think it through and give an honest answer. I would start personally to get worried within the context of Britain's age of consent if it was someone who was 15 with someone who was that much older. That's where I would start to get worried. And at 14 I would be like a flat no. So where would you be? At what point do you think that becomes horrible? So think about that. Okay. So let's change it a bit. Young girl, just turned 18. Okay. Her boyfriend is 20. Same, seems okay. Seems legit. 25? 30? 35? 40? At what point does that become creepy? At what level of age gap does it become creepy? You know, in that instance, everyone's legal, and yet we still at some point start to have a visceral reaction, a sense of disgust. At some point that kicks in, even when everyone's legal. So that's an aspect we have to consider in all this as well. Technology has given us further complications. So you got two 15-year-old kids. They fool around or whatever. Nobody particularly seems to care about any of that. Bit of heavy petting, bit of finger action, whatever. Who cares? Couple of teens, you know, making out, basically. The girl sends some posed nudie shots or even underwear shots to her boyfriend. He doesn't do anything with them. Maybe he transfers them from one device to another, whatever. It doesn't matter. He doesn't share them around. Somehow he gets found out. He ends up on the sex offender register for life, you know, as a distributor of child pornography, and all the rest, you know, the full force of the law falls down upon this kid. For what? For why? See, the law is not necessarily the best instrument, and it often does not have much wiggle room, especially in these areas where we like the law to be fairly strong and harsh, but maybe it should be a bit more forgiving. But then that, of course, opens up judges to being excoriated by the public when they make the wrong decision, when the public doesn't necessarily have all the facts. You know, there's all kinds of issues around consent, around age, around technology. People mature younger these days than they used to. Not that much younger, let's be clear, but it is younger than it used to be when a lot of these laws and so on were made. We're a much more sexually aware society, even if we're not necessarily more sexually active. I think we have more ways to deal with these urges in perhaps a less invasive and less dangerous way, through the easier access to pornography and so on. Whether that's good or bad, I think depends on your perspective, but there you go. Think back, if you can. When did you lose your virginity? I was under 16. I was ready. I was ready for about a year before that. It wasn't with an older person. So, what does that mean? Was that terrible? Was that wrong of me? I would have been ready a year before that, I think, but not much before that. When did you lose yours? When were you ready to lose yours? When did you feel emotionally and sexually mature enough? When did you want it? The age thing, the age gap thing is, I think, a separate issue, and I think a lot of our offence and reaction has much more to do with the power dynamic, the possibility of abuse, of the older, more experienced person being harder to resist, being able to impose, maybe having a degree of power over the younger person, whether through simple respect or in older ages employment, a position as a teacher or tutor, that kind of thing. We do definitely already have a double standard when it comes to encounters with teachers. When an older male teacher engages with a younger female student, there's hell to pay. When an older female teacher engages with a younger male student, they often are treated more leniently, not just by the law, but by the press and by society in general. Indeed, people think the boy is lucky. Is he? Maybe in some cases where he's mature enough and genuinely wants it, and is emotionally and intellectually developed enough to give informed consent, whatever his age, perhaps. But if I say that about older men and younger women, I think most people's reaction is much more visceral disgust. They're much less willing to even consider that the girl might be able to give informed consent, might be old enough to want it, might be old enough to pursue it. I remember girls at secondary school with rather hardcore crushes on some of the teachers who did pursue it. There were even scandals while I was at school, while I was at college, while I was at art college. Whether any of them were true or not, we never particularly got to find out, but, these things happened. And there is that double standard. Is there also a double standard when it comes to homosexual relationships? Perhaps there is. I think people are less willing to forgive. There's a long, false association between homosexuality and paedophilia. So I think people are much more ready to leap to judgment and to presume. This febrile atmosphere of pedo hunting doesn't just affect homosexuals, it affects straight men as well. There's policies of not sitting, children travelling alone next to men on flights. If you're a man who applies for a primary school job or a teacher's assistant job or so on, they will much more strongly go into your background and ask you a lot more probing questions, immediately suspecting you of being a paedophile, in that case, simply because you're male. And I think that's even worse for homosexual men. There's much more likely to be that presumption there. Have you ever been attracted to someone much older or much younger than you? Have you ever been attracted to someone underage before you knew that they were underage? I mean, this happens with celebrities with like countdown timers to it's legal, which is creepy and kind of horrible, but it is a public admission that physical sexual maturity can occur before the legal age, that interest and attraction can exist in a non-paedophilic way before the law catches up to their physicality. I think there's room for more fuzziness here. I think there are aspects to this where there's room for forgiveness, where you need to establish genuine guilt, manipulation, control. You need to establish the emotional maturity and so on of the other party, the younger party in these cases. But all of this is messy and incredibly difficult, and the law is not good at handling messy and difficult and nuanced decisions. So where do you draw the line? At what point does sexual maturity start for most people? At what point does sexual maturation end for most people? At what point can they be called adults? Brains don't finish developing until into your 20s, so should it be later? Should we understand and have compassion towards people that mature earlier? And what degree and what level of sexual autonomy do we give them? This is a huge, messy, difficult, nuanced topic that I think people have tried to broach, have tried to discuss, but then have instantly just been labelled as monsters, and that doesn't move the discussion forward. It certainly doesn't help any teenagers caught up in this situation. It encourages silence, and we continue to demonise perfectly legal relationships because of these age gaps and so on. So where is the line? I don't know. I'm just trying to get the brass from the muck here. I'm trying to get to the interesting meat of the conversation. Have you been in a relationship with a big age gap? Did you have a relationship where you were underage and the other party was overage, or the other way around? Was it sexual? I guess you can't say without being attacked in these comments. So I don't know. I just know that there is, as with many topics, a conversation to be had, and simply shutting it down by pointing and screeching or hurling wild accusations doesn't help us, doesn't help anyone, doesn't get any of us anywhere. But I think these are important discussions to be had, and I think even if the law doesn't have to be changed, I think 16 is about right, with a bit of leeway. I think you can make the argument for 15. At 14, I think things start to get shifty, and anything below that is kind of my limit. But is there room for understanding? Is there room for examination? Should kids who consent to each other be prosecuted even if their parents disagree? Should a slightly older partner with a slightly underage partner be prosecuted to the full extent of the law if they're protesting that they are truly consenting? I don't know. I just know a lot of lives are being fucked up by this, not necessarily appropriately. Well, what do you think? Weigh in, make a comment, make a response video, link it below. Let's get a conversation going here. Let's get some brass from the muck. Dang. Oh, and meet Hugin and Moonin, who will figure into some videos at some point. Still working on losing the eye though.